The blood on Landon Crawford's shirt had dried 3 days ago, but he still wore it like a second skin through the California wilderness, riding toward Calico with a bullet graze across his ribs that burned with every breath. He had not expected to find a woman standing outside the general store when he finally dragged himself into town that September morning in 1882, her auburn hair catching the sunlight like copper wire, a small leather case clutched in her hands as she watched the mountain man with eyes the color of storm clouds. Hannah O'Brien had come to Calico seeking distance from Philadelphia, from the suffocating parlors in the marriage her father had arranged to a banker twice her age, and she had brought with her the only skills she possessed, needle and thread, the ability to mend what was torn. She noticed the mountain man immediately, not because of his imposing size or the way his shoulders stretched wide enough to block the morning sun, but because of the dark stain spreading across his shirt, fresh blood mixing with old. "You are bleeding," she said, stepping forward before her mind could catch up with her body. Landon turned slowly, his hand instinctively moving toward the knife at his belt before he registered that the voice belonged to a woman. He studied her, the clean dress that marked her as newly arrived, the pale skin that had not yet been weathered by the desert sun, the determined set of her jaw that contradicted the softness of her features. "It is nothing," he said, his voice rough from disuse. He had spent the last 6 months alone in the mountains, trapping and hunting, speaking only to his horse in the wind. "It does not look like nothing." Hannah moved closer, ignoring the way his eyes narrowed in warning. "That wound needs cleaning and your shirt needs mending before infection sets in. I can manage." "Clearly you have been managing for 3 days already." She gestured to the filthy, blood-crusted fabric. "How is that working for you?" Despite the pain radiating through his torso, Landon felt the corner of his mouth twitch. Women did not usually speak to him this way. Most kept their distance from the mountain man, who came to town twice a year smelling of pine smoke and bare fat, his hair hanging past his shoulders, his massive frame draped in buckskin and fur. He stood well over 6 feet, his arms corded with muscle from years of swinging axes and wrestling pelts, his hands scarred from knife work and fire. "I have a room at the boarding house," Hannah continued, taking his silence as acquiescence. "Mrs. Henderson will have hot water. Come, I do not need, you do." She reached out and gripped his forearm, her small hand barely wrapping halfway around the thick muscle. "And I need the practice. I am trying to establish myself as a seamstress in this town, and a man dying of sepsis because he is too stubborn to accept help will not be good for business." Landon found himself following her, partly because arguing seemed to require more energy than he possessed, partly because something about her directness disarmed him. She led him through Calico's dusty main street, past the saloon where miners were already drinking away their meager earnings, past the assayer's office and the livery stable to a weathered building with a hand-painted sign that read Henderson's Rooms. Mrs. Henderson, a stout woman with flour on her apron and judgment in her eyes, took one look at Landon and started to protest. But Hannah cut her off with a stream of words about Christian charity and medical necessity that left the older woman sputtering and fetching hot water. Hannah's room was small and sparse, containing only a narrow bed, a washstand, and a trunk that she had hauled all the way from Pennsylvania. She directed Landon to sit on the single chair while she laid out her supplies: needle and thread, scissors, strips of clean cotton, a bottle of whiskey she had purchased for medicinal purposes. "Take off your shirt," she instructed, pouring water into the basin. Landon hesitated. He had not been this close to a woman in years, had not allowed anyone to tend to him since his mother died when he was 15. That was 17 years ago, a lifetime spent learning to need nothing and no one. But the wound was deeper than he had admitted, and he could feel the fever starting to build in his blood. He unlaced the buckskin shirt and pulled it over his head, watching Hannah's face for a reaction. She did not flinch at the sight of him, the broad expanse of his chest covered in old scars, the thick muscles of his shoulders and arms, the fresh wound cutting across his ribs like an angry mouth. Instead, she rolled up her sleeves and dipped a cloth into the hot water. "This will hurt," she warned, then pressed the cloth against the wound. Landon hissed through his teeth but did not move. The pain was sharp and immediate, radiating outward in waves that made his vision blur. Hannah worked efficiently, cleaning away the dried blood and dirt, her touch firm but careful. She had small hands, delicate fingers that seemed ill-suited to this kind of work, yet she moved with confidence. "What happened?" she asked, focusing on her task rather than his face. Disagreement with a claim jumper up in the mountains. He thought my trap lines belonged to him. Did you kill him? The question was matter of fact, without horror or judgment. Landon found himself answering honestly, no. But he will think twice before stealing again. Hannah nodded, reaching for the whiskey. This will hurt more. She poured the alcohol directly into the wound. Landon's entire body went rigid, his jaw clenched so tight he thought his teeth might crack, but he made no sound. Hannah watched his face, noting the way his eyes squeezed shut, the cords standing out in his neck, the white-knuckled grip on the chair arms. When she touched his shoulder, she felt the muscle trembling beneath her palm. Almost done, she murmured. You are doing well. Something about her tone, gentle but not pitying, encouraging but not condescending, made Landon's chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with the wound. He opened his eyes and found her looking at him, really looking, and for a moment the pain receded. Hannah bound the wound with clean cotton, wrapping the bandage around his ribs with steady hands. This close, she could smell him, pine smoke and leather, sweat, and something wild that reminded her of the forest she had read about in books, but never seen until she crossed into California. His skin was hot beneath her fingers, the fever already taking hold, and she knew he would need more than bandaging. You should rest, she said, stepping back to examine her work. The fever will get worse before it gets better. I have supplies to gather. I will be heading back to the mountains tomorrow. You will be dead before you reach the foothills. Hannah picked up his ruined shirt, examining the tears and stains with a critical eye. You need at least 3 days of rest, probably longer, and you need this mended. She held up the buckskin. I can fix it. You do not have to. I know I do not have to. I want to. She met his eyes, her expression softening. Let someone help you, Mr. Crawford. The world will not end if you accept kindness. He wanted to argue, wanted to explain that accepting kindness meant creating obligations, meant allowing connections that could be severed, meant opening doors he had sealed shut years ago. But the fever was making his thoughts fuzzy, and Hannah was already guiding him toward the bed with a firm hand on his arm. Just for an hour, he heard himself saying as his body betrayed him, the exhaustion of 3 days hard riding catching up all at once. Just for an hour, Hannah agreed, knowing it was a lie they both needed. Landon lay back on the narrow bed, his large frame taking up the entire space. Hannah pulled a blanket over him, noting how his breathing had already begun to slow. She gathered his shirt and her sewing supplies, settling into the chair by the window where the light was best. The buckskin was well made but had seen hard use. Beyond the fresh tears and bloodstains, she found older repairs, crude stitching done with thick sinew, patches sewn with uneven stitches. The work of a man who knew how to survive but not how to care for the details. She began with the worst tears, her needle moving in small, precise stitches that would hold through another season of hard wear. As she worked, she watched Landon sleep. His face, harsh and weathered when awake, softened slightly in unconsciousness. She could see the boy he must have been beneath the man he had become, the strong jaw that might have been called handsome, if not for the severity of his expression, the high cheekbones that spoke of mixed heritage, perhaps Shoshone or Cheyenne blood somewhere in his line. His hair, dark brown and streaked with sunlightning, fell across the pillow in tangled waves that reached his shoulders. She wondered what had driven him to the mountains, what had carved such careful distance between himself and the world. She recognized the look in his eyes, the wariness of someone who had been hurt and decided never to be hurt again. She had seen it in the mirror often enough during the long journey west, after she learned that her father had sold her future for a business loan, that her mother had said nothing in her defense. The afternoon stretched into evening. Mrs. Henderson brought up a tray of food and cast disapproving glances at the scene, the mountain man in the bed, the young woman sewing by the window, but Hannah paid her no mind. She had already broken every rule of proper society by running away from home, by traveling alone across a continent, by bringing a strange man to her room. What was one more transgression? She finished the major repairs as the sun set, then began the detailed work, reinforcing weak seams, replacing buttons, cleaning away the worst of the stains. The blood would never come out completely, but she scrubbed until the water in her basin ran pink, until the fabric looked less like evidence of violence and more like the natural wear of a hard life. Landon woke as darkness fell, his body jerking upright with a gasp, his hand reaching for a weapon that was not there. Hannah set aside her sewing and moved to the bed, her hand on his shoulder again. Easy, she said. You are safe. You are in Calico, at the boarding house. His eyes struggled to focus, the fever making everything swim. How long? 4 hours, perhaps 5. She pressed her palm against his forehead and frowned at the heat. The fever is higher. You need to drink something. She helped him sit up, supporting his weight with surprising strength for someone so small. He drank the water she offered, then the willow bark tea she had prepared while he slept, bitter and medicinal. His body wanted to collapse back into unconsciousness, but he fought it, awareness slowly returning. My shirt, he said, noticing it draped over the chair back, the firelight catching on fresh stitches. Nearly finished. Another hour and it will be good as new. Hannah settled beside him on the edge of the bed, close enough that he could feel her warmth. How do you feel? Like I was shot. You were shot. A smile tugged at her lips. But you will survive, provided you rest and let the wound heal. I cannot stay in town for 3 days. I have traps set, supplies cached. If I am not there, the traps will wait. The supplies will keep. Her voice was gentle but firm. What good are any of them if you die? Landon had no answer for that. He lay back down, too tired to argue, and watched her return to her sewing. The domesticity of the scene unsettled him. The woman bent over her work, the soft light painting her features in gold, the quiet companionship of shared space. He had forgotten what it felt like, this simple comfort of not being alone. Why did you come to Calico? He asked, surprising himself with the question. Hannah's hands stilled on the fabric. I needed to go somewhere. My father could not find me. What did you do? I refused to marry the man he chose. She resumed stitching, her voice steady. I packed a bag, took the money my grandmother left me, and bought a ticket west. He will be furious, but he will also be embarrassed. And his embarrassment will keep him from pursuing me too vigorously. By the time he overcomes his pride, I will have established myself here as a seamstress. As a seamstress, she confirmed. It is honest work, and I am good at it. Better than I am at being an ornament in a parlor, at any rate. Landon studied her profile, the determined line of her jaw. You are brave. I am terrified, she corrected. But being brave and being terrified are not mutually exclusive. Sometimes you simply do what must be done, regardless of the fear. He understood that. He had built his entire life on that principle, doing what must be done, surviving because the alternative was unacceptable. But hearing it from her, this small woman who had crossed a continent alone, who had faced down a bleeding mountain man without hesitation, made something shift in his chest. The fever took him again during the night. Hannah woke to the sound of his ragged breathing, found him thrashing in the bed, his skin burning. She spent hours sponging him with cool water, forcing more willow bark tea between his lips, changing the bandage when fresh blood seeped through. She did not sleep, could not risk leaving him alone with the fever demons that made him cry out in languages she did not understand, that made him reach for her hand and grip it like a lifeline. Mother, he whispered once, the word in English but the grief universal. Shh, Hannah murmured, smoothing his sweat-damp hair back from his forehead. Rest now, you are safe. By morning the fever broke. Landon woke to find Hannah asleep in the chair, her head resting on her arms on the edge of the bed, still holding his hand. The sight of her exhausted and rumpled, her hair falling loose from its pins, dark circles beneath her eyes stirred something in him that he had thought long dead. He extracted his hand carefully, trying not to wake her, but her eyes opened immediately. She straightened, wincing at the stiffness in her neck. How do you feel? She asked, her voice hoarse with fatigue. Better. It was true. The fever haze had lifted, leaving his head clear for the first time in days. You stayed awake all night. The fever was bad. I was worried. She stood, stretching, and Landon watched the movement, the way the morning light caught in her hair. Are you hungry? He was ravenous. Hannah left to fetch breakfast, returning with a tray laden with eggs and bacon, biscuits and coffee. They ate together in comfortable silence, and Landon marveled at how easy it was, how natural it felt to share a meal with her. Your shirt is finished, Hannah said, pointing to where it hung on a peg by the door. I could not get all the blood out, but the repairs should hold. Landon examined her work, tiny, even stitches that were nearly invisible, reinforced seams, careful patches. It was better than new, better than it had ever been. This is fine work. You should have no trouble establishing yourself here. I hope you are right. She cleared the breakfast dishes, then hesitated. Mr. Crawford, I was wondering if you might help me with something. Landon, he corrected. And what do you need? I need to understand the people here, what they need, what they can afford. I need to know what kind of work will keep me fed through the winter. She turned to face him. You know this country, these people. Would you teach me? The request surprised him. Most people wanted nothing from him except distance. But Hannah looked at him with those storm cloud eyes, and he found himself nodding. "I need to stay in town for supplies anyway," he said. "3 days, you said. I can spend that time showing you around." The smile she gave him was worth every moment of fever and pain. They spent the next 2 days exploring Calico together. Landon, moving slowly to accommodate his healing ribs, introduced Hannah to the miners who would need their clothes mended, to the shopkeepers who could refer customers, to Mrs. Chen, who ran the laundry and knew everyone's business. Hannah took it all in, asked intelligent questions, began building the web of connections that would sustain her. She learned that Calico was a silver mining town, that it had boomed in the last year, but might bust just as quickly, that fortunes were made and lost on the turn of a pick. She learned which miners were honest and which would try to cheat her, which families had children who would grow out of their clothes, which men were dangerous when drunk. Landon was surprised by how much he enjoyed playing guide. He had never thought of himself as part of Calico's community, had always maintained careful distance, but seeing the town through Hannah's eyes made it new again. He noticed things he had overlooked before: the way the morning sun turned the desert red, the sound of children playing near the schoolhouse, the smell of fresh bread from the bakery. And he noticed Hannah. The way she moved through the world with quiet determination, the way she treated everyone with the same courtesy regardless of their station, the way she laughed when a miner's child showed her a lizard he had caught. She was lovely, he realized, not in the delicate way of the women in the saloon paintings, but in the way of useful things: a good knife, a well-made saddle, a rifle that shot true. On the 3rd day, as they walked back to the boarding house after visiting the assayer's office, Hannah stumbled on a loose board in the sidewalk. Landon caught her automatically, his hand spanning her waist, and for a moment they stood frozen, his body warm against her back, her breath catching. "Thank you," she said softly, not pulling away. "Hannah." His voice was low, rough. "I should leave tomorrow, head back to the mountains. I know, but I do not want to." She turned in his arms, looking up at his face. "Then do not." "It is not that simple. I have obligations, the traps. We'll wait another week. We'll wait a month." She placed her palm against his chest, feeling his heart pound beneath her hand. "Landon, I know you live up there alone because it feels safer than risking connection. But safety and loneliness are not the same thing. What are you asking me?" "I am asking you to stay. I am asking you to let me finish what I started mending, not just your shirt, but whatever it is that keeps you hiding in those mountains." Her eyes searched his. "I am asking you to give us, a chance." Landon looked down at her, at this woman who had appeared in his life like a gift he had not known to wish for. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to retreat to the familiar isolation of the high country where hearts could not be broken because they were never offered. But her hand was warm against his chest, and he was so tired of being alone. "I will stay another week," he said. "But Hannah, you should know I am not an easy man. I have forgotten how to be anything other than what I am. What you are is brave and strong and kind, even though you try to hide it." She smiled. "And if you have forgotten how to be anything else, then we will remember together." He kissed her then, bending down to capture her mouth with his, and she responded with a hunger that matched his own. The kiss was clumsy. At first he was out of practice, and she was inexperienced, but they learned each other quickly, fitting together in a way that felt inevitable. Miss Henderson found them on the sidewalk and made her disapproval known with a sharp clearing of her throat. Hannah pulled back, flushed and breathless, but she did not let go of Landon's hand as they walked the final blocks to the boarding house. That evening, Landon rented his own room. Propriety demanded it, even in wild Calico, but he spent most of his time in Hannah's, talking until the oil lamp burned low. He told her about his childhood, about the Shoshone mother who had died of fever and the French trapper father who had taught him to survive before drinking himself to death. He told her about the years alone in the mountains, about the peace he found in silence and solitude, about the fear that had kept him there long after peace turned to loneliness. Hannah told him about Philadelphia, about parlors filled with people who said nothing of consequence, about the crushing weight of expectations, about the moment she realized that if she did not run, she would spend her life as a decorative object in someone else's home. She told him about the train ride west, about the terror and exhilaration of each mile that took her farther from everything she knew, about arriving in Calico with $10 and a sewing kit, and hoping it would be enough. "It is more than enough," Landon said. "You are more than enough." She kissed him for that, soft and sweet, and he wrapped his arms around her carefully. mindful of his healing ribs, marveling at how perfectly she fit against him. The week stretched into 2, then 3. Landon made a quick trip to the mountains to collect his stored furs and check his trap lines, but he returned to Calico within 5 days, riding hard because he could not stand to be away from her. Hannah's seamstress business grew steadily as word spread of her and fair prices. She repaired miners' clothes torn by rock and labor, sewed dresses for the few respectable women in town, even made curtains for the new schoolhouse. Landon found work around Calico helping to build a new barn, clearing brush for fire breaks, guiding a group of tenderfoot prospectors into the hills for a fee that kept him in supplies for a month. The work felt different than it had before Hannah. It felt like building something rather than just surviving. They fell into a rhythm, meeting for breakfast at the boarding house, spending evenings together, talking or reading by lamplight, stealing kisses in the shadows behind the general store like teenagers. The town watched their courtship with interest. The mountain man and the seamstress, the loner and the newcomer, two people who had no business fitting together, but somehow did. It was Mrs. Chen who finally said what everyone was thinking. She cornered Hannah at the Mercantile one morning in late October, 3 months after that first day in Calico, and fixed her with a knowing look. "That man loves you," she said without preamble, "and you love him. So why do you still sleep in separate rooms?" Hannah felt her face heat. "We are not married." "Then get married. What are you waiting for?" "I do not know if he wants. We have not discussed." "Men never discuss. You have to tell them what is happening." Mrs. Chen patted her arm. "He is a good man, even if he is rough around the edges. Do not let him slip away because neither of you has the courage to speak." Hannah carried those words with her through the day, turning them over in her mind as she hemmed a dress for the banker's wife. The truth was that she did love Landon, had fallen for him somewhere between that first day and now, had tumbled headlong into loving his quiet strength and hidden gentleness, his fierce protectiveness and rare smiles. But she did not know if he felt the same, did not know if the mountain man who had spent 17 years alone was capable of choosing a different life. She found him that evening at the livery stable, brushing down his horse. The animal was as massive as its owner, a bay gelding with a white star on its forehead and the patience to carry a large man through rough country. Landon looked up when she entered, and his face softened in the way that was becoming familiar, the way that made her heart skip. "I need to ask you something," Hannah said, setting down the lantern she carried, "and I need you to answer honestly, even if the answer will hurt." Landon set aside the brush, giving her his full attention. "All right, do you love me?" The question hung in the air between them, stark and vulnerable. Landon looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable, and Hannah felt her courage waver. "Yes," he said finally. "I love you. I have loved you since the day you bullied me into your room to fix my shirt, maybe before that. I love you so much it scares me, because I have spent years building walls and you walked through them like they were made of paper." Hannah let out a breath she had not known she was holding. "Then why have we not talked about a future? Why do we keep pretending this is temporary? Because I am afraid." Landon moved toward her, his movements slow and deliberate. "I am afraid that if I ask you to tie yourself to me, you will realize what a poor bargain it is. I have nothing to offer you, Hannah. No house, no steady income, no knowledge of how to be a husband or build a family. I am a mountain man who knows how to skin a bear and read tracks, but not how to dance or make conversation at a dinner table. I did not cross a continent to find someone who could dance," Hannah said. "I came here to find freedom, to build a life on my own terms. And what I found was you." She closed the distance between them, taking his hands in hers. "I do not need you to be anything other than what you are. But I need to know if you are willing to try, willing to build something with me even though it terrifies you." "I want to try," Landon said. "God help me, I want to try so badly I can barely breathe for wanting it." "Then marry me," he blinked. "You are asking me?" "Someone has to," and Mrs. Chen said men never discuss things. Hannah smiled, though her hands trembled in his. "Landon Crawford, will you marry me? Will you let me mend not just your shirt but your life, and will you help me mend mine in return?" Landon laughed, a sound so rare and genuine that it drew tears to Hannah's eyes. He picked her up, lifting her clear off the ground, mindless of the twinge in his ribs, and spun her in a circle. "Yes," he said, "yes, I will marry you, Hannah O'Brien. I will marry you and spend every day trying to be worthy of you." They were married 2 weeks later by the circuit judge who passed through Calico on his monthly rounds. Hannah wore a dress she had sewn herself from blue calico fabric, the pattern simple but elegant. Landon wore his buckskin shirt, the one she had mended. Someone had convinced him to trim his hair and beard. He still looked wild, but he looked happy too, and when he took her hand before the judge, his grip was steady. The whole town turned out for the wedding. Mrs. Henderson had softened enough to allow the ceremony in her boarding house parlor, and Mrs. Chen prepared a feast that filled 3 tables. The miners gave them a set of cooking pots, the shopkeeper donated fabric for quilts, and the saloon owner, surprisingly, gifted them a rocking chair he had been saving for his own mother before she died. Landon had spent the last 2 weeks building them a cabin on a piece of land he had claimed years ago at the base of the mountains, about 5 miles from town. It was rough work, the kind he knew how to do, and he had poured all his anxiety and hope into every log, every nail, every shingle. The result was small but solid 2 rooms, and a loft, a stone fireplace, windows that faced the morning sun. He carried Hannah over the threshold that evening after the celebration ended, and she laughed with delight when she saw what he had done. The cabin was furnished with simple pieces, a bed frame he had built, a table with 2 chairs, shelves for her sewing supplies. But there were touches that showed his care: wildflowers in a jar on the table, a quilt that Mrs. Chen had helped him choose, a lantern hanging from a hook to light her work. "It is not much," Landon said, setting her down carefully, "but it is ours. It is perfect." Hannah whispered, "It is everything I did not know I wanted." That night they consummated their marriage with a gentleness that surprised them both. Landon, who had known only rough encounters in the past, discovered that tenderness was more powerful than passion, that taking his time and learning her body was more satisfying than his own release. Hannah, who had feared this part of marriage based on whispered warnings from other women, found instead a connection that made her feel whole, a physical expression of the emotional intimacy they had already built. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, skin cooling in the night air. Landon held her close, one arm wrapped around her waist, his chin resting on top of her head. "I never thought I could have this," he said quietly. "I thought I had used up my share of happiness when my mother was alive. Happiness is not a finite resource." Hannah traced patterns on his chest, following old scars with gentle fingers. "And you deserve it as much as anyone. I will try to make you happy. You already do." They built their life together through that winter. Hannah continued her seamstress work, and miners would ride out to the cabin to drop off mending or pick up finished pieces. Landon hunted and trapped, kept the cabin in good repair, and chopped enough firewood to see them through to spring. They worked side by side, learning each other's rhythms, building the small intimacies that made a marriage. Hannah learned that Landon woke before dawn and liked to watch the sunrise with his coffee, that he sang to himself in Shoshone when he worked, that he had a dry sense of humor that emerged once he felt comfortable. Landon learned that Hannah hummed when she sewed, that she read everything she could get her hands on, that she had a stubborn streak as wide as his own when she thought she was right. They argued sometimes about money, about whether to buy a milk cow, about how much time Landon should spend in the mountains versus in town. But they learned to argue fairly, to listen to each other, to compromise. And they learned that making up after an argument was one of the better parts of marriage. Winter brought snow to the mountains and cold winds that howled around the cabin. Landon banked the fire high and taught Hannah to cure hides, to render fat into soap, to identify animal tracks in the fresh snow. She taught him to read. He knew his letters, but had never bothered with actual books. And they spent long evenings taking turns with her battered copy of Shakespeare, laughing over the flowery language, arguing about the motivations of characters. Christmas came, and they were snowed in for 3 days, just the 2 of them and the howling wind. Landon gave Hannah a set of bone buttons he had carved from deer antler, each one unique and beautiful. She gave him a new shirt she had sewn in secret, the stitching so fine it looked like embroidery. They spent those 3 days in bed more than out of it, learning new ways to bring each other pleasure, talking about dreams and plans and the future they were building together. Spring arrived with a rush of meltwater and blooming desert flowers. Hannah discovered she was pregnant in April, almost exactly 7 months after they met. She told Landon one morning as they sat on the porch watching the sunrise, and he froze with his coffee cup halfway to his lips. "Are you certain?" he asked. "As certain as I can be. I have missed 2 courses now, and I have been sick every morning for weeks." She watched his face anxiously, unable to read his expression. "Are you happy about it?" Landon set down his cup and pulled her into his lap. Holding her so tightly, she squeaked in protest. Happy does not begin to cover it, terrified maybe, overwhelmed. But Hannah, yes, I am happy, so happy I do not have words for it. He was also terrified, truly terrified, in a way that even claimed jumpers and grizzly bears had never managed. The thought of being responsible for a child, of having someone depend on him the way he had never been able to depend on anyone, filled him with a panic that woke him in the middle of the night. But Hannah was steady and certain, and her confidence slowly became his own. They prepared through the summer. Landon built a cradle from cedar wood, sanding it until it was smooth as silk. Hannah sewed tiny clothes and blankets, her needle flying through soft fabrics. Mrs. Chen and the other women in Calico rallied around Hannah, offering advice and supplies, preparing for the birth with the efficiency of people who knew that new life was precious in a place where death came easy. The baby came in December, almost a year to the day since Landon and Hannah married. The labor was long and hard, 18 hours that tested Hannah's strength and Landon's sanity. He stayed by her side the entire time, holding her hand, wiping her forehead, feeling helpless and desperate as she struggled to bring their child into the world. When the baby finally emerged with a lusty cry, Landon wept. He stood in the corner of the bedroom with tears streaming down his face, while Mrs. Chen cleaned the baby and Hannah laughed with exhausted relief. And when Mrs. Chen placed the infant in his arms, a boy, healthy and whole and perfect, he felt something inside him crack open, all the walls he had built over 17 years of solitude crumbling to dust. His name is James, Hannah said from the bed. After your father. Landon looked at her in surprise. His father had been a hard man, difficult and distant, but he had taught Landon to survive. Maybe that was its own kind of love. James, he repeated, looking down at his son. James Crawford. Being a father was harder than anything Landon had ever done. The baby needed constant attention, feeding and changing and soothing when he cried. Landon, who had faced down mountain lions without flinching, was reduced to panic by the sound of his son's wails. But he learned, slowly and clumsily, and Hannah guided him with patience and humor. He learned to change diapers without gagging, to rock the baby to sleep while humming old Shoshone lullabies his mother had sung to him, to check on James a dozen times each night to make sure he was still breathing. He learned that love could be exhausting and exhilarating in equal measure, that he would gladly give up sleep and peace and sanity for this squalling, red-faced creature who had stolen his heart. Hannah watched her husband transform. The mountain man who had been so afraid of connection became a father who wore his son in a sling against his chest while he chopped wood, who talked to the baby in a constant stream of Shoshone and English and French, who could be moved to tears by the sight of tiny fingers wrapped around his thumb. James grew from infant to baby to toddler, and the cabin rang with his laughter. He was fearless and curious, climbing everything within reach, investigating every bug and lizard, following his father around like a shadow. Landon taught him to walk by, letting him grab onto his fingers and toddle along beside him, taught him his first words in 3 languages, taught him that the world was full of wonders if you paid attention. When James was 3, Hannah discovered she was pregnant again. This time Landon did not panic. Instead, he built an addition onto the cabin, another bedroom, a bigger common room, a proper root cellar. He worked through the summer heat, driven by the need to provide for his growing family, and Hannah would bring him water and sandwiches and sit watching him work, her hand on her swelling belly. The second baby, a girl they named Grace, arrived in spring with much less drama than her brother. She was small and dark-haired like her mother, with eyes that would eventually settle into the same storm cloud gray. James was fascinated by his sister, wanting to hold her constantly, bringing her offerings of flowers and interesting rocks. Life settled into a new rhythm. Landon spent less time trapping and more time doing work closer to home, guiding, hunting for the restaurants in Calico, building cabins for newcomers. Hannah's seamstress business thrived, and she trained 2 young women from town as apprentices. They were prosperous by Calico standards, not rich but comfortable, and they used their resources to help others, hiring men who needed work, paying fair wages, extending credit when times were hard. The years passed. James grew tall and strong like his father, with the same quiet intensity and careful observation. Grace was all energy and questions, exhausting and delightful in equal measure. They had a 3rd child when James was 7, and Grace was 4, another boy they named Thomas, who arrived laughing and barely slowed down enough to sleep. Through it all, Landon and Hannah's love deepened and evolved. The passionate intensity of their early days mellowed into something steadier but no less powerful. They knew each other completely, the good and the bad, the strengths and the flaws, and chose each other anyway. Every day, Landon learned that he was capable of more than survival, that he could build and nurture and grow. The mountain man who had been so alone learned to be a husband and father, learned to exist at the center of a family that needed him and loved him. He still went to the mountains sometimes, needing the solitude to recalibrate, but he always came home because home was where Hannah was. Hannah learned that courage came in many forms. She had been brave to cross a continent alone, but she was brave too in the daily work of building a life, of raising children in a harsh land, of loving a difficult man with patience and grace. She became a pillar of the Calico community, the woman people came to when they needed practical help or wise counsel. On their 10th anniversary, they sat on the porch of their expanded cabin watching the sun set over the mountains. The children were asleep inside James, reading by lamplight. Grace and Thomas sharing a bed because Grace was afraid of thunder and a storm was rolling in. Landon held Hannah's hand, his thumb tracing patterns on her palm. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked. "Staying here, marrying me, choosing this life?" "Not for a single moment." Hannah leaned against his shoulder. "Do you?" "I regret every year I spent alone in those mountains before you found me." Landon kissed the top of her head. "All that wasted time when I could have been living instead of just surviving. You were not ready before. We met when we were supposed to meet, maybe." He was quiet for a moment, listening to the distant rumble of thunder. "That first day, when you saw my bloody shirt and decided to help me, what made you do it? You did not know me. I could have been dangerous." Hannah smiled. "You were dangerous. You still are in your way. But I saw something in your eyes that I recognized someone who had been hurt and was trying not to get hurt again. And I thought, if he lets me help him, if he lets me in even a little, then maybe I am braver than I think. Maybe we both are. You changed my life. We changed each other's lives." She laced her fingers through his. "That is what love does." The storm broke over the mountains, rain drumming on the cabin roof. Inside, they heard Grace call out, and Landon went to comfort her while Hannah checked on the boys. They moved through the familiar rituals of bedtime, tucking in children, banking the fire, locking the door against the night. Later, in their own bed, they made love with the ease of long practice, finding pleasure in the familiar landscape of each other's bodies. Afterward, wrapped in each other's arms, listening to the rain and the soft breathing of their children in the next room, Landon thought about the man he had been before Hannah, hard and closed, and alone, and barely recognized him. "Thank you," he whispered into the darkness. "For what?" Hannah asked sleepily. "For fixing my shirt, for fixing me, for giving me a reason to come home." "You gave me a home to come to," she replied. "And you let me mend things you never showed anyone else. That was the bravest thing of all." They fell asleep like that, tangled together, the mountain man and the seamstress who had found each other in the wild California desert and built something lasting from needle and thread and stubborn courage. The years continued to pass, marked by the milestones of family life. James grew into a young man, serious and capable, splitting his time between helping his father guide hunting parties and studying engineering from books Hannah ordered from San Francisco. He had plans to build bridges and dams to bring water to the desert towns, and Landon supported those dreams even as he privately mourned that his son would not follow him into the mountains. But Grace showed every sign of becoming a mountain girl. She could track a deer before she was 10, could start a fire in the rain, could read the weather in the color of the sky. She followed Landon everywhere, soaking up his knowledge, and he taught her everything he knew: survival skills and wilderness wisdom, the things his mother had taught him, and the things he had learned alone. People sometimes commented that it was not proper for a girl to learn such things, but Landon would fix them with a look that silenced all criticism. His daughter would know how to survive, propriety be damned. Thomas was different from either sibling, gregarious where James was serious, charming where Grace was intense. He loved people and stories, and he had a gift for making friends wherever he went. By the time he was 12, he knew everyone in Calico and half the surrounding territory, and people sought him out for his good humor and creative solutions to problems. Hannah said he would be a politician or a salesman, and either way he would change the world. Landon and Hannah watched their children grow with pride and occasional terror. Raising children in the West was not easy. There were accidents and illnesses, close calls with rattlesnakes and flash floods, the constant awareness that danger lurked at the edges of their carefully built safety. But they kept their family safe and gave them roots strong enough to support any future they chose. Calico changed too. The silver played out in the late 1890s, and the boomtown began to bust. Families moved on, businesses closed, the population dwindled. But Landon and Hannah stayed, along with a handful of others who had put down roots too deep to pull up. They adapted. Hannah expanded into general dressmaking and alterations for the surrounding ranches. Landon took work managing a large cattle operation in the mountains, and they endured. They were in their 50s when the 20th century arrived, older but not old, weathered by sun and wind but still strong. Their children were grown. James working on aqueduct projects in Los Angeles, Grace married to a rancher and living in the high country she loved, Thomas running a successful freight business between Calico and the railroad. Landon looked different than he had that first day Hannah met him. His hair, still long, had gone gray at the temples, and his face was lined with sun and time. But he was still massive and strong, still capable of working from dawn to dusk, still protective of his family with a fierceness that had not diminished. Hannah's auburn hair had silver threaded through it now, and her hands bore the calluses of 40 years of needlework. But her eyes were still storm cloud gray, still quick and intelligent, and she still had the determination that had carried her across a continent to find freedom. On a September morning in 1902, exactly 20 years after that first meeting, they sat together on their porch watching the sunrise. It had become their ritual, this quiet time before the day began, coffee cups warming their hands, the desert coming to life around them. "Do you remember the first time we sat here?" Hannah asked. "This porch did not exist then. The whole cabin did not exist." Landon smiled. "But yes, I remember. You had just told me you were pregnant with James, and I was certain I would be a terrible father. You were wrong about that." "I was." He looked at her, this woman who had saved him in ways large and small. "I was wrong about a lot of things. I thought I needed to be alone to be safe. I thought letting someone in meant being weak. I thought love was something that happened to other people. And now? Now I know that being alone is not the same as being safe. That letting you in was the strongest thing I ever did. That love is not something that happens to you. It is something you choose every day, over and over." He took her hand. "I choose you, Hannah. I have chosen you every day for 20 years, and I will choose you for however many days I have left." Hannah felt tears prick her eyes. After 2 decades of marriage, he could still surprise her with his eloquence, this man who claimed to have no words. "I choose you too, Landon Crawford, today and always." They sat in comfortable silence, hands linked, watching the sun paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson. Somewhere in the distance a coyote called. Closer. They heard the sounds of Calico waking dogs barking, roosters crowing, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer. "What do you want to do today?" Hannah asked. "This," Landon said simply. "Sit here with you, watch the sunrise. Be grateful for every moment of the life we built." He squeezed her hand. "Maybe later we can ride up to the old cabin site, the place where I used to trap. I want to show you the aspen grove where my mother is buried. I should have taken you years ago." "I would like that." They finished their coffee and began the work of the day, Landon tending to the horses and chickens, Hannah working on a commissioned dress for a rancher's daughter. But mid-morning they saddled up and rode into the mountains, following trails Landon knew by heart. The old cabin site was gone, reclaimed by the forest, but Landon found it unerringly. The aspen grove his mother loved was golden with autumn color, the leaves trembling in the breeze. He led Hannah to a flat rock where he had carved his mother's name in Shoshone Small Bird, who sang, and the year she died. Hannah knelt and placed her hand on the stone, paying respects to the woman who had given Landon life and taught him to survive. "Tell me about her," she said. So Landon did, sitting beside his wife in the golden light, sharing stories he had never told anyone. He talked about his mother's laugh, her skill with medicines and songs, the way she had tried to give him roots even as his father pulled him toward the wandering life of a trapper. He talked about her death, about the fever that took her in 3 days, about the way his father had fallen apart afterward. "She would have loved you," he said finally. "She always said I should find a woman with strong hands and a stronger heart, someone who could mend what was broken." "You were not broken," Hannah said gently. "You were just alone. There is a difference, maybe." Landon stood and pulled her up with him. "But you mended me anyway. That first day when you fixed my shirt with such care, taking time to make the stitches perfect, even though I was just a mountain man who would tear it again in a month, that was when I knew." "Knew what?" "That you saw me. Not the scary outsider or the rough mountain man, but me, Landon, the person under all the armor." He cupped her face in his hands. You looked at me like I mattered, like I was worth the effort. No one had looked at me that way since my mother died. Hannah leaned into his touch. You mattered then, and you matter now. You matter to me, to our children, to the people whose lives you have touched. You are not alone anymore, Landon. You will never be alone again. They rode back to the cabin in the golden afternoon light, and Landon thought about the strange turns life could take. A bullet graze and a bloody shirt had led him to Hannah. Her courage with needle and thread had opened doors he thought were sealed forever. And now, 20 years later, they had built something that would outlast them both, a family, a legacy, proof that even the most solitary heart could learn to love. That evening, their children arrived for dinner, James riding in from town, where he was consulting on a water project, Grace and her husband coming down from their ranch, Thomas appearing with a wagon full of supplies and a new joke to tell. The cabin filled with laughter and conversation, with the sound of grandchildren playing and the smell of Hannah's cooking. Landon sat at the head of the table he had built and looked around at the faces of the people he loved. His family, his home, everything he had never dared to dream of during those long years alone in the mountains. And he thought about that September morning 20 years ago when he had ridden into Calico bleeding and closed off, never imagining that a small woman with needle and thread would tear down every wall he had built. "What are you thinking about?" Hannah asked, reaching over to squeeze his hand. "About how lucky I am," he said simply. "About how one act of kindness can change everything." After dinner, after the children left and the grandchildren were bundled into wagons for the ride home, Landon and Hannah sat on their porch again, watching the stars come out. It was their ritual, the bookend to their morning coffee, and they had performed it thousands of times. But it never grew old, this simple pleasure of being together. "I love you," Landon said into the darkness. "I do not say it enough, but I love you more than I have words to express." "I know," Hannah replied, her head on his shoulder. "I have always known. You show me every day, in 1,000 small ways. You do not need words for what is already clear. Still, I want to say it. I love you, Hannah Crawford. I love the life we built, the family we raised, the home we made. I love that you fixed my shirt and would not let me run away. I love that you saw past the scary mountain man to the person underneath. I love that you chose me, even though I gave you every reason not to. And I love you, Landon Crawford. I love your strength and your gentleness. I love that you let me in, even though it terrified you. I love that you became the man you always could have been, once someone gave you a reason." She lifted her head to look at him. "I would do it all again, you know. Every hard moment, every challenge, every fear. I would do it all again for the chance to spend my life with you." He kissed her, slow and deep, and tasted salt from tears, his or hers. He did not know. It did not matter. They were one person now, their lives so intertwined that separating them was impossible. They went to bed that night wrapped in each other's arms, the same way they had every night for 20 years. And Landon fell asleep thinking about thread and needles, about a shirt mended with perfect stitches, about a woman who had seen a bleeding mountain man and decided to save him in every way that mattered. The years continued their march. Landon and Hannah grew older, their hair going fully gray, their bodies slowing but still strong. They celebrated 25 years of marriage, then 30, then 35. Their children gave them more grandchildren, and they watched new generations grow up in the shadow of the mountains Landon loved. Calico became a ghost town, most of the buildings abandoned to wind and sand. But Landon and Hannah stayed in their cabin, becoming a fixture of the desert landscape. The old mountain man and his seamstress wife, who had built an impossible love in an impossible place. On their 40th anniversary, a September morning in 1922, they sat on their porch watching the sunrise for the 1,000th time. Landon was 73 years old, his body still powerful but showing the wear of a hard life. Hannah was 68, her hands gnarled from arthritis but still capable of fine stitching. 40 years, Landon marveled. "When I rode into Calico that day, I thought I had a week at most before I died of infection. Instead, I got 40 years of happiness. 40 years and counting," Hannah corrected. "We are not done yet." "No," he agreed. "We are not done yet." They had many good years still ahead of them, years of watching grandchildren grow, of celebrating births and weddings, of sitting on their porch sharing coffee and memories. Landon taught his grandsons to track and hunt, taught his granddaughters that strength came in many forms. Hannah taught them all to sew, to mend what was broken, to see value in repair rather than replacement. When Landon finally died, it was at age 86 in his own bed with Hannah holding his hand. He went peacefully in his sleep, his last words a whispered, "I love you," to the woman who had saved him 53 years earlier. Hannah grieved, as was natural, but she did not fall apart. She had learned from Landon that strength meant carrying on, that love did not end with death but transformed into memory and legacy. She lived another 7 years, surrounded by family, still sewing until her hands finally refused to hold a needle. And when she died at age 82, her children found a letter she had written, to be read at her funeral. The letter told the story of a mountain man with a bloody shirt, a seamstress with needle and thread, and how one act of mending had changed both their lives. It talked about courage and love, about choosing connection over safety, about the power of seeing people for who they really are rather than who they appear to be. And it ended with this: "Your father was the bravest man I ever knew, not because he fought bears and outlaws, but because he let me in when everything in him screamed to run away. He let me mend not just his shirt but his heart, and in doing so, he mended mine as well. We built a life together from nothing but determination and love, and I would not trade a single moment of it, not even the hard ones, not even the painful ones." He taught me that true strength lies in vulnerability, that real courage is choosing to love even when it is terrifying. Remember him, remember us, and remember that love, real love, is always worth the risk. The letter was read to 3 generations of Crawfords gathered in the little church in Calico, in the town that had mostly disappeared but still held on because some families refused to let go of their roots. And every person, their children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, understood that they existed because a woman had seen a bleeding mountain man and decided to help, because a man had let her fix his shirt and in doing so had learned to fix his life. James kept the shirt, the original buckskin shirt his mother had mended that first day. It hung in a glass case in his house in Los Angeles, the stitches still perfect after more than 50 years, a testament to skill and care and love. And he told his children the story, as they told theirs, generation after generation, about how a simple act of mending had created a legacy that would never fade, because some things, once properly fixed, never break again. Some stitches hold forever, and some love stories, begun with thread and needles and courage, echo forward through time, proving that even the hardest, most solitary hearts can learn to love if someone is brave enough to try. In the end, that was Landon and Hannah's true legacy, not the children they raised or the property they owned, but the proof that transformation is always possible, that walls can come down, that love can heal what isolation has wounded. They proved that a mountain man could learn to be a husband and father, that a runaway seamstress could build a life of her own choosing, that 2 broken people could mend each other into something whole and beautiful. And it all started with a bloody shirt and a woman who knew that sometimes the most important things to mend are the ones hidden beneath the fabric, the wounds that do not show, the parts of the heart that have been torn and need gentle hands to stitch them back together. Their cabin still stands in the California desert, maintained by family who refuse to let it crumble. The porch where they drank their morning coffee for more than 50 years still faces east, toward the sunrise. And sometimes, on September mornings when the light is just right, visitors swear they can feel the presence of the mountain man and his seamstress, still keeping their ritual, still choosing each other, still proof that love can bloom in the harshest places if you are brave enough to let it grow.